Namaste, Ganesh ji.
Namaskar. Thank you very much, Paturi ji, for taking the time. I know you're a very busy person, so I greatly appreciate both the time to read the manuscript and to spare the time to talk to me about this today. Thank you very much.
Today it's a very great day. We are able to meet the author of a very important book for Indic knowledge systems, a book on our Puranas. Ganesh ji has come out with a book on Puranas from a rational understanding perspective. We could use the word scientific perspective also, but he prefers to use the word rational rather than scientific. Am I right, Ganesh ji?
Both of them, actually, very well said. Both rational and scientific.
Yeah, scientific comparing to the contemporary scientific understanding. Puranas are enlisted to be 18 Mahapuranas and around 18 and even more Upapuranas. And these Puranas have many types of content. Some of them are narrative content, they are stories. Some are non-narrative content where there are conversations between rishis and rajas, rishis and rishis. And they were almost encyclopedic in nature. They contained material that belonged to various fields. Ganesh ji is focusing on cosmology part of the knowledge that is contained in the Puranas in this book. Let us try to know from Ganesh ji what is his background and what made him to coming to the area of research on Puranas. Ganesh ji, can you please give us a brief introduction of your professional background, your life, and how and what made you to come into the field of research on Puranas?
Paturi, I'm an engineer. I'm an engineer from IIT Delhi. I did mechanical engineering. I worked as an engineer. I enjoyed my job as an engineer, and then I went on to do management at the IIM Ahmedabad. And then since that, I've been in sales and marketing and management related functions. That has been but all of it in technology, right? Because it was for practically all my career, I worked in sales and marketing of technology products, basically. So it's never been very far away from me. And I was an avid reader as a child. I used to read everything. I used to read a lot. And when about 10 years ago or 12 years ago, because of the pressure of professional work, I stopped reading actually. And then some friends of mine said, why don't you start reading again? And I said, listen, I've read everything. And then slowly I started developing a love for Indian history and Indian heritage and so on. So for the last 15 years, I've read about that. And that led me to say, okay, let me read the Puranas, because that seems to be a body of knowledge that transcends history. It goes before history. And to be honest, I didn't know what to expect. I'll be very honest with you. I have no intent of writing a book or anything. I just wanted to just know about this text. And I started reading it. Independently had an interest in cosmology. As a science student in school, I used to read popular science magazines and books, popular books on science relating to cosmology. And I followed that up. I was very, very surprised to find, really, I'll be honest, very surprised to find such a lot of cosmological references in the Puranas. And at some point I had to start writing. I just couldn't help it. I just said, this is just too much of a coincidence for people to just ignore it completely. So briefly, that's how it got me into this.
Oh, okay. So then within the various aspects of Puranas, various aspects that cover Puranas, cosmology has been one of the areas focused. Carl Sagan, for example, also talks about Hindu cosmology, and he quotes from Hindu Puranas. And people talked about various aspects of Hindu cosmology from, say, for example, Bhagavata Purana
Right.
and other books.
Right.
What is your understanding of the existing research on the cosmology in Puranas?
So first thing is I haven't done a literature survey of the field. So if I say if I'm not accurate and I mean accurate enough, please forgive me. But what little I have read about the other works in the Puranas is that they have focused on one or two of the Puranas, right? Maybe two or three of the more popular, not or maybe more widely available Puranas. Maybe that's the best way to say it. And I maybe the best way to describe this is that I once I started reading my first Purana was the Matsya Purana, right? Just and for a different reason. And I started reading it and I was fascinated. So once I finished the Matsya Purana, I started reading and reading. And then I went to the Shiva Purana, then the Bhagavata Purana, then the Brahmanda Purana. It's when I started reading the third or the fourth or the fifth Purana that I started understanding that you have to look at many different Puranas and combine the knowledge in all of them, right? For us to come up with a composite picture of what the sages had in mind. And so I don't believe that has been done up until now. People have gone in great depth in one or two Puranas, but very few people have gone into. For example, in this book, I have cited from at least 15 different Puranas. There are
Oh,
quotations in verses from 15 different Puranas.
yeah, that's really comprehensive. Your coverage of Puranas is much more comprehensive than other cosmological studies on Puranas. Certainly, sir. Yeah. Yes.
And that was an accident. Like I said, it's not that I thought that there was something incomplete. I was just reading Puranas for the joy of reading Puranas. I used to enjoy reading it really. And then when I somewhere near my fifth Purana, I said, okay, there is a lot more detail here. And then somewhere around the second or third Purana, I started making exhaustive notes. I started taking notes because there's such a lot of detail and information. It's not, the Puranas don't present, first thing is Puranas are encyclopedia of knowledge, like you said, right? They contain everything from, of course, cosmology to medicine, to the science of music, to temple making, so many different aspects of life. So you have to extract the ones that are of interest to you so that you don't forget it later. So I used to either copy it digitally or physically and make notes of these because I was just fascinated. I used to wonder how is it that 2000 years ago or whenever the Puranas was written, somebody could have so much knowledge. So I was really fascinated by the whole topic. And I started writing things down, and as I wrote this down, I said, this is an enormous amount of knowledge. And that it was a pure accident. I'll be very honest. It's not like I felt that there was some shortcoming in today's knowledge that I thought I should do more research. It was pure accident, and I'm happy to have spent the time, to be honest.
Yeah. So, and this way of looking at Puranas as encyclopedic books on knowledge is there in the West also. Professor Natra Fry from Princeton University, in his book Anatomy of Criticism, he talks about actually it's a book on genre classification of literature, and as such, he classifies books into various kinds, and he mentions a category called encyclopedic literature. And as part of that, he mentions books like Puranas, Sthala Puranas, and Mahabharata. Particularly, he mentions Mahabharata as an encyclopedic book. And the first classical Telugu poet of 11th century, while introducing himself and claiming his qualification to write Mahabharata in Telugu, he calls himself Brahmanda di Purana Nana Purana Vijnana Niratun.
Oh,
He says, I am a Vijnani, I have Vijnana, I have knowledge, but all this knowledge is coming to me from Brahmanda Adi Nana Purana.
correct.
From Brahmanda Adi, all the Puranas.
Right.
And those were the days when uh, acquiring knowledge, sources of knowledge for people were different from the way we have now, textbooks, university books and all that. Instead of that, people used to consider Puranas also as something like a textbook, something like
Absolutely.
from which they could acquire knowledge. And these Puranas were compiled
Correct.
by the author or authors. Some people call it authors, but we consider in the Hindu tradition all the Puranas to have been compiled by and composed by Veda Vyasa. In your book, you have a beautiful chapter,
Right.
the last chapter on Veda Vyasa also. We will go to that topic of
Definitely.
how Veda Vyasa compiled this whole knowledge.
Right.
And the way these Puranas have been compiled is in the narrative forms, in the story form also, though it appears to be story, in fact, it is a statement of fact, it is a scientific statement.
Right.
A
Right.
scientific statement is converted into a story statement.
Very well said.
Actually, in this book, Northrop Frye, in his book Anatomy of Criticism, he uses the word hypothetical nature of narratives or
Oh,
hypothetical nature of myths, and he says a statement in chemistry or a statement in mathematics, which is in the form of if A then B, is converted into a narrative statement in these narratives.
very well said. I didn't know that. Wonderful.
And in my PhD dissertation, which is on how to interpret mythology from the insider's perspective, from a Vedic perspective, that was my PhD on. And in that, I made a proposal uh, of a grammatical nature. For example, while we narrate any story, whether it is a folk tale or a fairy tale or legend or a myth, when we narrate stories, we use simple present tense for narrating past.
Correct.
Actually, in some classical grammar books, they use the statement that simple present is being used for narrative past.
Correct.
For example, we say that the king mounts on the horse and the king rides on the horse. The king attacks the criminal, and we use attacks, mounts,
All
and all
present
the
tense.
present tense
Yeah.
for the past tense.
Very well said. Yeah.
So what I proposed is that what narratives in the Puranas are doing, what the myths and mythologies are doing is, they are doing exactly the reverse. They are converting the simple present statements into past tense.
Ah, okay.
That is, they are making statements of facts. They are making theorizing statements
Right.
that, for example, sun emerges from a previous creation.
Correct. Correct.
If that is the statement, the Purana converts that into a past statement saying that sun emerged instead of emerges, it says
Correct.
emerged.
Correct. Correct. Correct.
So it is changing the simple present tense into past tense. So
Correct.
this is another way of looking at the hypothetical nature of these narratives in the sense that they are converting discursive statements,
Right.
logical, rational statements into narrative statements.
Very true. Very true. Very true.
So what people like you are doing is you are extracting the simple present tense from the past tense.
That's true.
Uh, you are drawing the statements of generalizations of nature,
Right.
generalizations of natural laws,
Right.
generalizations of nature observations
Right.
from what it appears to be past tense, what it appears to be a story.
Very well.
Uh, you're doing it from these Puranas. So I'm very, very happy to meet you, sir, and get this knowledge from you. For example, your analysis of Martanda, and you already mentioned your fascination with Matsya Purana, your love for it, your respect for it. It is considered to be one of the most primordial and very important and fundamental Puranas.
Correct.
And
Correct.
Martanda is mentioned as a Manu there. He is the first Manu, so to say, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
And the word Martanda, the word literally means Mrita Anda. It comes from there. And sun is what is being described there
Correct.
in that story. Please tell us something about your Martanda analysis, sir.
So I and so So when I first read about, so first thing is, I think you encapsulated it very well, right? So I think the etymology of the word Martanda as being composed of the Mrita and the Anda, you have encapsulated very well. And in all honesty, I read a very interesting story, right? So you read the story and it's very nice, right? So the son is born, and it's a little curious that you think of the sun as being, because you look at the sun, it provides light, it provides heat, it provides energy to the planet, and it's not immediately obvious why they would describe it as a mrita anda, right, as a dead egg basically. But anyway, I thought it was very interesting, and I kept reading on, and then I read about the story of the marriage of Vivaswan, right, the marriage of Vivaswan to Samjana. That was also an interesting story about the sun. And then I read about the story about the sun as the Samvartaka Aditya. And so that is the sun. And it says that, and I'll be honest, I didn't understand that story initially. And I, and as I was listening to an astronomy podcast, just to as a parallel about science, just to understand. I keep doing this just to stay abreast with the scientific progress. And they described it almost exactly. They said that when the current sun becomes a red giant, it's about 3 to 4 billion years from now, it will practically swallow up all the planets, and it'll heat up the Earth completely. And I said, my God, that is what I read in the Puranas. How is that possible? So I thought, first thing I said, maybe I've read wrong. So I went back and read the Puranas again. The description was absolutely accurate. And then after the red giant phase, the sun collapses. The star, any star, collapses, and it becomes a very small and very cold object, right? And so what happens after that is that all the water that is in the atmosphere becomes clouds. It starts forming clouds and starts forming rain. And I said, that is again an astonishing bit of insight. Then I put all of these four together. I put the Martanda together, Martanda, and then the Vivaswan. The Vivaswan, actually, I found out later, a little later, is an intermediate part of the life of a sun, where it's called a T Tauri star. It's just before birth, just before it becomes a sun. For about 10 million years, it's a very young and an active star. And I was shocked, I'll be very honest. I was just shocked that the Puranas can, through stories, through mythology, can communicate these four parts so clearly. Actually, that was one of the starting points. The other starting point was the story of the moon. Maybe we'll come to that later. But this was one of the starting points that completely startled me. And I said, how accurate this whole thing is. And then you go back and look at the Martanda story, and then you realize that before the sun becomes the sun, it's actually just becomes a ball of gas. And that ball of gas doesn't emit any heat, it doesn't emit any light, but it's just a gigantic ball of gas. And so it's like a mrita, it's inert, it's lifeless, and so it's mrita, right? So it's dead. And it's an anda because it's a ball of gas, a sphere of gas. And that's when the whole thing about the life cycle of the sun came across to me. And I tell you, it shook me. It just shook me completely that something can be described in such great detail in a text that is thousands of years old, right? So it was the beginning of my understanding in great depth about Puranas, to be honest. So I first congratulate you for understanding the Mritanda as the birth of the sun in your research many years ago. But for me, it was new. I had no experience to this, and it was an aha moment for me, actually.
Actually, your understanding of these Manu stories, the Martanda is the first Manu, and from this point of view, from the point of view of son, is really very interesting. The second Manu, for example, is a Swarochisha Manu. He
Right.
is the narration comes from Markandeya Purana, and there he is described to be the son of Swarochi. Because he is Swarochi's son, he becomes Swarochisha.
Correct.
And Swarochi, the very word Swarochi, is self-luminous.
Oh, okay.
Rochis is light.
Right.
Swarochis is
Moonlight.
self-luminous.
Okay.
And the definition of any star in contemporary physics, in contemporary scientific understanding is they are self-luminous bodies.
Absolutely.
And that very foundational definitional nature of sun is given as the name of Swarochi, and Swarochi's son is Swarochisha. That becomes the second person.
Yeah.
And that Markandeya Purana has this story that there is a Pura called Arunaspada Pura. You can see the word Aruna. Aruna is the redness. Arunaspada Pura is the sunrise portion, and allegorically it explains the travel of one Brahmin from Arunaspadapura to Himalayas and then losing his route, and then he becoming the cause of the birth of Swarochi through the Vanadevata of the previous creation, and then Swarochi Shamanu is born out of that. And this story has been taken as the plot for a 16th century kavya, 16th century epic narrative poem by one Allasani Peddana of the Krishnadevaya period.
Wow. Okay.
And he adds his beautiful descriptions and everything and makes
Right. Right.
this whole story into a kavya.
Right.
And that has been recently translated into English also by David Schulman and another partner of him. So these stories are actually stories of sun. That's what I argued in my PhD dissertation also,
Right.
that this Manu Charitra story is actually story of sun,
Right.
and how this myth is related to the ritual of, say, Savitri Devata and all that. Those
Correct.
things discussed in my PhD dissertation. So this is wonderful, sir. Actually, your life cycle of sun itself, the entire life cycle of sun you describe in your book, that probably has not been described in other books.
Right.
Actually, people talked about sun and the cosmology and
Correct.
other stars and galaxies and all
Correct.
that.
Correct.
The way you have done it in your book about the entire life cycle of sun
Right.
has not been analyzed in other books. And you have an analysis of moon also from the
That's
Puranas. Can you please explain to us?
actually, yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. So to me, that was the starting point actually. And even when many years ago, um, I had heard about the story of the moon. And at that time, I thought it was very strange. There's a story of the moon having 27 wives. Why would a moon have 27 wives in the story? So that story stuck at the back of my head. And then as I was reading, again, I was reading the Puranas, and after the Brahmanda Purana, I read an Upa Purana called the Kalika Purana. Right? Maybe you've heard about this, right? It's an Upa Purana, yeah. And I read it, and then again, it has a lot of details about the moon. It is amazing the amount of detail that's there. Same thing, I was listening to another podcast. I have to go on some work or something of that sort. So I spent about half an hour, 45 minutes in that car. So I said, okay, I might as well use that time productively, and I listened to such podcasts. And that described to me about the current scientific view of the origin of the moon. And that talked about how a protoplanet collided with the Earth, became had a big debris field of dust around the Earth, and then that dust became the moon. Just like the dust around the sun became the planets, the dust around the Earth became the moon. And about 1 month or 2 months ago, I had read about in the Kalika Purana about the moon colliding with the Earth, and I thought that was very strange. I said, how is that possible? And then when I heard this on the podcast, I was like, this is too much of a coincidence. So as soon as I heard this, I remember coming back home, reading up all whatever I could find on the web, validating what I heard in the podcast, then going back to the Puranas and reading it. And then actually the Puranas break it up. And this is a field of investigation. It's not even fully understood today. So there's a lot of research that's going on in the US and some of the major universities around this. But a couple of things are clear. First thing is they are clear that there was some collision of a large body with the Earth, and that created a big field of dust and particles in space. And that dust and particles over a period of time came together to form the moon. Now, in the current scientific way, all that happened within a few 100 million years or something like that. But in the Puranas, they have the same sequence of events, right? But the sequence of events is actually spread out over a much larger period of time. So there is a collision that's described in the Kalika Purana, in about 10 verses or verses in some detail, and then in the reappearance of the moon from that field of dust. That's a very common thing, right? So you can go to the Matsya Purana, you can go to the Bhagavata Purana, the churning of the ocean. It says one of the first divine beings to come out of the ocean was the moon, right? And so when I saw it, I said, that is amazing how they have described it. Only the thing is the two are not together. They are separated by quite a large interval of time. And so that was, I found that very interesting. And then when I read it in greater detail again and again, then it seemed to come together extremely well, right? And so that was one part that, again, I read all of this and I wonder, how is it possible for somebody so many years ago to have this knowledge, right? It just, even after having written this book, it completely amazes me how such a thing is possible. But that's what the texts say, right? And so I can't close my eyes to what the texts say, right? So I just thought I should write about it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's really very interesting. This churning of the ocean has been described in so many different ways by different people, but you have successfully taken it as a cosmological description.
Okay.
And actually, the other meanings that people are taking are also possible because I think Puranas have got a meta level understanding inscribed in them. So the meta level formulae of multiple happenings in multiple levels of creation probably are embedded in these books. So each one can take
Absolutely.
his own or her own kind of meaning
Right.
from these books.
Right.
And you have talked about the Great Flood also, the
That is
Ark of Noah,
correct.
and that version of the Great Flood.
Correct.
And the other version in the Puranas also, both the versions. Can you please explain to us the two different versions of the Great Flood that you have discussed in the book?
So that's what when I said I first started reading the Matsya Purana, it's because I wanted to read about the Indian version of the flood story. So I didn't know what the Matsya Purana was. I knew that it related to the Great Flood, to the Pralaya basically. So I said I should read it, right? Because I can't just be aware of the biblical story and the Egyptian story, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. You should also understand something about our own story. So that's where it started. And the Matsya Purana has a very good detail about the Great Flood. But the Kalika Purana it's an Upa Purana again, right? The Kalika Purana is an Upa Purana, and it has two chapters on the Great Flood, right? So that was interesting for me. And then the Bhagavata Purana is a Mahapurana. It's not just a Mahapurana, it's one of the most respected Mahapurana. It's a very highly revered Mahapurana. Right?
Yeah.
So, so one of the things that used to bother me is that even in the Puranas, when you compare this life cycle of the sun dies at the end of its life cycle. There is no cyclicality in the sun, right? If it dies, it just becomes a white dwarf and then a black dwarf and basically disappears. Or at least science doesn't know what happens to it after that. But in the Hindu text, in the Puranic text, life goes on in cycles, right? There are kalpa cycles that go on and on. So it used to worry me how is it possible for these kalpa, for the cyclicality to take place. So what I did then was, so I used to think about it, and then I read the Bhagavata Purana, and two or three things in the narration really caught my eye. First thing is, it talks about the fact that like while all of the other flood stories talk about a boat, the Bhagavata Purana talks about an earth boat, right?
Oh.
Yeah. And this phrase comes up 2 or 3 times. So I said, that's a very strange phrase. What is the meaning of an earth boat, right? And then the second thing it says is that it says the fish was 100,000 yojana in extent. So the 100,000 yojana, if you recall in the Puranas, they always describe the earth as 100,000 yojana. Right? The extent of the earth, Jambu Dvipa, is 100,000 yojana. Now, what is the point in having 100,000 yojana fish? Where will you put that fish, right? There is not enough space on the planet to put 100,000 yojana fish. So that seems strange. But the part that was most interesting was that it's very explicit. It says that the boat floated through the night of Brahma, entire night of Brahma, and sometimes it says that the night of Brahma is as long as a kalpa, as long as a day of Brahma, which is billions of years, 4.3 billion years. That was strange. And the second thing it said is that this it was being pulled by this fish, and the boat was not sent by any god, right? It was not built by anybody, but it was sent by Vishnu, and there was no day or night, there was no light during this period because it was the night of Brahma. And when I put all of these together, and then I went back to the life cycle of the sun, then I realized that the only way to explain the whole thing, and probably the best explanation possible, is that when the sun dies, it does not have the gravity to hold all the planets around it. And the planets basically drift away into space. And so when the planets drift away, there is no light, there is no sun, there is no moon, there is nothing, right? That is the only way you can explain the night of Brahma. It explains the pralaya, it explains the night of Brahma, it explains a lot of things in the cycle of in the whole cycle. And when the earth comes close to another sun, then you have the cycle of creation starting again, right? So it's basically at that time that this earth now gets light and heat and energy from a new sun, and then activity starts again, right? Because you need for any activity, you need energy. And so to me, that was a big aha moment, really. So first was the moon, second was the life cycle of the sun, and the third thing was this great flood. And always, whenever for example, in the biblical story, in the Egyptian story, after the flood, there is creation. So they say creation started all over again. So once the kalpa begins, then the creation starts all over again. So I thought this was a amazing set of things that kind of came together and fitted very well from an overall perspective. So
this flood story seems to be one of the most universal theories all over the world with regard to creation and all that. The only distinction that we see on the Purana side is that it is made part of a cyclic view of time.
Correct.
In all other views, because there is a linear view of time, there was a flood in the beginning and the creation starts from there.
That's
and it is going to end. That's all. But in the Puranic view, you have a flood getting repeated in every kalpa. And that's what you brought out very well. What it means by a cyclic kind of repetition of flood and all that. Another beautiful thing that I find in your book is about the earth. And with regard to the earth, even recently in an online forum, there was a discussion about spherical nature of the earth, whether it has been described in the Puranas or not. And we have places in some Puranas where it is described as a circular disk, if not some flat object.
Correct.
There is a description of a circle, there is a description of a mandala,
Right.
but you have a spherical description, say in books like Surya Siddhanta.
Correct.
But whether such a spherical description is there in Puranas or not was being discussed in that forum. But you were categorical in saying that it is spherical in the Puranas. Can you please elaborate your evidences and your view, how you could arrive at that?
I'll be very honest with you, Dr. Paturi. This was the most difficult part for me, right? And I say this because as I was reading through it, so I understood the moon, I understood the sun, and I thought, and I understood the Brahmanda, the structure of the Brahmanda, and I was thinking, how is it possible that any body of knowledge can describe the sun, can describe the moon, but has no idea about the earth, right? It just doesn't add up, right? It doesn't sound right.
Yes.
You won't believe it. I printed the pages relating to the earth from 5 or 6 different Puranas, and I made a file out of it. And I would read it every day for about 2 months. And I said, there has to be something somewhere that points to this.
That's
And
quite a work. Yeah.
huh?
That's quite a work. You have.
But I had to, because it just didn't sound consistent. You know what I mean? It just doesn't sound right that such a thing can happen. And then I found it. And there are actually 2 references. One is in the Matsya Purana and one is in the Vayu Purana. And it's actually more clear in the Vayu Purana, where he says, so first thing is, everywhere the earth is described as 100,000 yojana, right? So generally we assume a yojana is about 12.3 kilometers, right? Based on a 1.6 centimeter angulam. You multiply everything, it will come to about 12.3. Different people have, Surya Siddhanta has a different definition and so on. And I found many 2 or 3 definitions of the yojana in the Puranas. So there is a verse which says, from the Gangotri to the Kanyakumari, right? From Gangotri to Kanyakumari, there is the distance is 1,000 yojana, right? And then it says the same distance is 9,000 yojana in a circular way. I said, what is that? And these are adjacent verses, right? I think it's verse 80 and verse 81 or something like that. I don't remember. It's not like it is written in one chapter and it is written in some other chapter or something else. These are 2 verses adjacent to each other, both in the Matsya Purana and in the Vayu Purana. And I was surprised. I said, one of these has to be wrong. Both of these cannot be right. And then I realized 2 things. I said, first thing is, we can measure the distance today, right? These are both places on the planet today, right? So I can go to Google and find out the distance between Gangotri and Kanyakumari is about 2,600 kilometers. So if you say it's 1,000 yojana, so it's about 4 kilometers to yojana or something like that. 2 point. And then if you say the same distance is 9,000 yojana, you get to 0.29 kilometers to a yojana, right? Same 2 adjacent verses. Once you come to 0.29 kilometers to a yojana, then you realize 2 things. First thing is that the 100,000 yojana is 29,000 kilometers, right? And that is a much more reasonable size for the earth, right? Because if you say 12.3 kilometers times 100,000 is 1.2 million kilometers. Even the moon is only 385,000 kilometers. So there is no dimension on earth which is 1 million kilometers or more. So, but once you get down to this 0.29 kilometers to a yojana, then you realize that, okay, this is the landmass of the earth that is being talked about here, right? And then he's measuring this in a circular fashion. So again, he has an idea of the sphericity of the earth. He has an idea of the fact that it is a circle. And so the author has hidden it, but if you look at it carefully, it is there, right? So that's the first piece of information that I could get. The second thing, like you said, is I went to read the Surya Siddhanta, because both of these texts are around the same time. I don't know exactly when they are, but they are about 2,000 years old, both of them. And the Surya Siddhanta is very explicit. It describes the earth as a sphere, right? And even in the Puranas, you will find 1 or 2 verses which says the earth is a sphere, or the mountain, Mount Meru is a spherical mountain, or a circular mountain, or something of that sort, right? And so then I started wondering, okay, I said, okay, these are 2 similar bodies of knowledge. We need to marry the 2 together. We need to first derive from the Puranas what it says, and then use the Surya Siddhanta to validate it. So I started with this. So I started with the Puranas, and I used this to say, okay, I used the 2 verses that I talked to you about to say, okay, the land mass of the earth is the Jambudvipa. The hemisphere of the landmass of the earth is Jambudvipa. If you look at the water around it, below 23.5 degrees south, 90% of the surface is water. It's all water below that. And so that becomes the salt ocean, it's really a salty ocean. So that's not a problem. And then the distance is also 29,000 kilometers because it is about slightly less than 3/4 of the circumference of the Earth. And then what I did was, okay, I said, let's assume this is correct. Then do the rest of the descriptions match. Then I went in to say, okay, what is there for Ketumala Varsa? What is Ilavrata Varsa? What is Hari Varsa? What is a description of each of these Varsas in the Brahmanda Purana, the Matsya Purana, in the Bhagavata Purana, or wherever? And then I bring all of those back and say, okay, if you assume this to be correct, all the verses about the Jambu Dvipa make sense. Everything else makes sense. And then the Surya Siddhanta also aligns with it. So I spent a lot of time on this because it is the most difficult thing to understand, really. I mean, to be honest, it's very difficult to understand.
Most controversial thing also.
Yeah, I just felt that the entire work would be incomplete if I did not address this problem. It's a very fundamental problem. This is not some sun or the moon which is far away from. This is our planet. We live on it, right? If we can't have a good understanding of it, how can we say the Puranas? How can we make a strong case for the Puranas? So I'll be honest, I spent a fair amount of time trying to decode this. And I'm glad that I think the results are quite acceptable.
But the effort was worth it, and you came out with wonderful, well substantiated writing about the spherical nature of Earth and all that is described in the Puranas. And you also talk about the maps, the geological maps in the Puranas. Can you explain to us about
Yeah.
those?
So once you do that, then you start looking at it, and then because there is a first thing is there's a beautiful verses in the Padma Purana. Just two verses. It says uh, um, the the land. So it says the earth is basically two pipala trees and two hairs. Everything else is covered with everything else is covered with water. And you look at that and you say, oh my God, this is so simple as a description of our planet. The two pipala trees are the continents of Africa and South America. And the two hairs are the Eurasian subcontinent and the North American subcontinent. And you can, if you look at it on a sphere, you have to look at it on a sphere, then you can see what is the head of the hair, what is the tail of the hair, and so on. It becomes so clear. And I said, my God, they could describe it so elegantly 2000 years ago. That means, and then you look at it and say, okay, what Ketumala Varsa becomes the African subcontinent, then the Sringavan mountain, and then the Uttarakuru Varsa becomes the South American subcontinent. And it is written very clearly. It is not even that I have to imagine it or something of that sort. Especially the Surya Siddhanta is very explicit about it. There is no interpretation required from a story or something. It says that there are four cities on the four circumference of the earth, and they belong to four Varsas. And the first Varsa is Bharata Varsa, and then Ketumala Varsa, and then Kuru Varsa, and then Bhadrasa Varsa, and Bhadrasa Varsa will come to later. But these are very, very clearly defined as three different continents in three parts of the earth. So between the two of them, I felt very confident that this is the right description. More importantly, they had a view. They had a view of the entire planet, at that time. And I had no idea how they got it, but they had that view, and they very beautifully describe it in the text. Yeah.
That's
So I hope
amazing.
that was not a very long answer.
So actually, it's very difficult to imagine how such observations were made. Were there telescopes used, or what were the tools that they used, and how they were able to take a view of this planet from above, as if somebody is able to see that from a distance,
Very
and
well.
all that. But whether whatever is the tool that they have used, whatever is the observational method they have used, they're coinciding with the contemporary understanding of these things is what you're bringing out so clearly, with a well substantiated way. Usually, some questions about the youngsters nowadays about that kind of knowledge being available in the Puranas is that they say that, see, you now know the contemporary cosmology, contemporary geology, and you bring this knowledge, read it into the Puranas, but can you tell us anything that the Puranas add new value to the contemporary understanding of cosmology? What the contemporary cosmology is not able to tell me, if Puranas are able to tell me and add new value, that will be very useful for us. What are such things you have brought out from your?
So I want to be very careful, right? So whenever you make a new claim as a person of science, as a person of technology, you have to substantiate the claim, right? And actually the Brahma, I quote in the book, the Brahmanda Purana actually talks about this nature of knowledge. It says, there's a verse in it which says, basically the scriptures, inference, reasoning, etc., are sources of hypotheses. They have to be tested and validated before they are accepted by an intelligent person. Right? It's very clear. It is the scientific method that we follow today. The Purana itself says this.
Yeah.
Right? So let me tell you a couple of things which is divergent, right, in the Puranas. And to me, unless it is proven, we have to treat it like a hypothesis, right? To be honest, right? But because it's from the scriptures, we shouldn't dismiss it. There is obviously some thought that has gone into it. We have to figure out what is the way to validate these things, right? In that context, the first thing that I found different was in the origin of the moon. In the origin of the moon, the moon. So in the scientific theory, the moon collides at there is a proto-moon called, which the scientists have called Theia. It's a hypothesis. So it's called giant impact hypothesis. They say it collided with the Earth, and that collision between these two planets created a giant ball of dust, right? And which formed the moon. Now, the moon, this proto-moon, the Theia planet, came from the sun, just like the Earth came from the sun. It was one of the other planets that came from the sun and ended up colliding with the Earth. The Puranas are very clear. The Puranas say that there was a collision, there was dust, but the planet that came, collided with the Earth came from Atri, right? The star, which is a different star, right? And it actually describes the passage of this moon from the star Atri to the planet Earth, to our Brahmanda, to the planet Earth. So it describes the passage. It's and I don't know if you've heard the story of the Tarakamaya War. It's a very fascinating story that describes a lot of detail anywhere. So that's one area where the two diverges, right? No, I can't say that it's true. To me, it's a valid hypothesis. I show in the book that it is a valid hypothesis, but we need to figure out how to prove it, right? It's not
Yeah. So you probably would like to propose that the contemporary astrophysicists or cosmologists can take such proposals of hypothesis and work on their own research.
very well said. Very,
So
very well said. Thank you
yeah,
very much.
Puranic knowledge inspires you to take up a new research on these questions,
Correct.
which does not exist in the contemporary understanding.
And I actually make a comment. I make a comment to this saying that, so that's one aspect. The second aspect is about the Earth being a part of the solar, of another sun. Maybe I don't want to get into that, but that's, you have to follow the entire train of logic in the book to get into it. So that's another thing. But getting back, and the third thing is the source of water on the Earth, right?
Oh.
And we all know of the story of the Ganga came down to the Earth.
Bhagirathas, Gangavatarana.
But the amount of detail that is there in the Puranas, if you read the Puranas carefully, is just amazing. It's just amazing in terms of, and current science thinks of these primarily as coming from asteroids or short period comets, which are from the Kuiper belt or within our solar system, basically. The Puranas are very clear. They say it comes from way outside our Brahmanda, which means way out trillions of kilometers away, and it came to the Earth, and as it came to our Brahmanda, to our solar system, it formed a sheath around it, and then from this sheath, slowly, and this the Bhagavata Purana describes it as a sheath. The Shiva Purana describes it as getting caught in the hair of Shiva, right? That story you heard, right? That Ganga was trapped in the matted locks of Shiva's hair, yeah? And then it gently got released from there and came to the Earth, and it came to the Earth through comets and asteroids and everything else. But current science looks at this water, this frozen water, as being inside our solar system, essentially. Whereas the Puranas are very clear, it comes from far outside, and they describe it in some amount of detail, which is quite fascinating. So
it is another place where probably the contemporary science can take an inspiration and try this hypothesis, test this hypothesis that it is extraterrestrial.
Correct.
Source of water is extraterrestrial, and they can work on that. So these are for the youngsters. These are some examples that we can tell that we are just not copying what is already there. There are other things that can be actually seen as a new idea that we can work on. And you also talked about the three lokas.
Correct.
That's another very, very important contribution. We keep getting this epithet of three lokas, three worlds, repeatedly in our literature as a popular metaphor, popular word. It repeatedly gets used. But what are these three lokas is always intriguing and elusive. Can you please tell us what you explained about, for example, Patala? People are very curious about that Patala thing. And what are these three lokas?
So let me start with the three lokas. And you're right. From childhood, even as a child, whenever you hear a story, or even when your mother talks to you, she talks about Bhuloga or something of that sort. And so you keep hearing about this, but it's very hard to get our head around this. So the Skanda Purana is very explicit. I have quoted that verse from the Skanda Purana. It says very clearly, the Bhuloka is the surface of the earth. It is the place where the plants and the humans and the animals inhabit this Bhuloka in this world. The Bhuvar Loka is the atmosphere, and it's very clear. It says the birds and the clouds, they reside in this area. The birds, the insects, and the clouds are in this area, the Bhuvar Loka. And the Swara Loka, they say, goes all the way to the Dhruvatara. Right? It's a definition. It's a definition of a region of space that goes all the way to the Dhruvatara. And it's very clear. It's not, there is no interpretation required, or that I have to read a story and say, okay, this means this. It's just one or two verses, and very clearly it says what is given here. In fact, what is interesting is that the Skanda Purana has actually a verse which describes the distance of the Dhruvatara to the earth. And so it's not accurate. I don't want to say it's accurate, but it is surprisingly close for a document that is this old, right? Because we keep using it describes it in yojanas, and we know that there are many different translations of the yojanas, right? What is the yojana in each case? So I don't know what the translation, but if I use the standard translation, it's close. So it's not exactly the same. It's not like 80% same or something. But I'm just surprised that they can think of, the ancients could think of this distance being described in so much detail, right? I don't want to say beyond that. So this is described explicitly. I don't have to imagine anything to write this. And then of course they talk about the Mahatloka, the Tapaloka, Janaloka and Tapaloka, and then the Brahmaloka. The interesting thing so these are the three lokas, and then the lokas beyond it. And then they clearly say that the Mahatloka is an intermediate loka, and the Janaloka, Tapaloka are regions which are not at the end of a kalpa. At the end of a kalpa is when the sun dies, these are regions that are not influenced by the end of a kalpa. And that is surprising because by the time you come to the distances described there, there is no gravitational, the sun stops having any gravitational effect at this. So the sun can collapse and nothing will happen there. So to me, that is, so I don't know if this was an accident or if it was, if they knew about it, but if they knew it, it was a phenomenal coincidence. So just to put that in context. So that was a very big insight that they could have. They could visualize these distances of the planets and the galaxy and so on.
Patala,
Huh?
Patala,
The Patala was very interesting. So the Patala actually, so again, you keep hearing about the Patala from childhood, right? I mean, you keep hearing about it in stories or something of that sort. And then I'm reading the story in the Brahmanda Purana about the descent of the Ganga, the sons of Sagara, the son of King Sagara. The sons of King Sagara, they go and Sagara rules the earth and he performs the Ashwamedha Yajna. And the horse is allowed to roam all over the country, right, to establish his rule. And it goes near the sage Kapila, and the sage, for some reason, sage Kapila he's in meditation, he gets disturbed, and the fire from his eyes burns the sons of Sagara who accompany him. And so when the king finds out, he gets very unhappy, and he asks his grandson, because his sons have died, says, go to the Patala and get these horse back. And I said, oh, he just said, go to Patala. And then that is the first phrase that started off my thinking, right? And I started going through, okay, where is this Patala? Because it describes it as the king, sage Kapila is described as sitting in a dry ocean bed. So first in that, you don't understand what's a dry, how can the ocean bed be dry? Then it says, sage Agastya had drunk up the waters and the ocean bed became dry. And so basically, sage Agastya is sitting at the bottom of the ocean where there is no water. And then you start putting these things together and say, okay, so this is what the Patala is. And then you look for other references. Are they all pointing to the same thing? You may say, yeah. And to me, that was another aha moment. So, okay, this thing all comes together as a Patala. There's also some references in the Surya Siddhanta about the Patala. But I didn't quote that. But there is sufficient reference in the Puranas about the Patala that we can actually, to be honest, Dr. Paturi, they describe each of the Patalas. For example, there are 7 Patalas, Atala, Sutala, Vitala, Talatala, and so on, right? The Brahmanda Purana actually goes to the level of describing the soil, color of the soil, and the nature of the soil in each of these Patalas.
Oh.
Amazing, really. And it's just the richness of this detail, right? I mean, for one individual to absorb all this, it's a lot, right? And so they not only had a vision of the Patala, but they had the vision of the intermediate Patalas as well, right? Of all the 7 domains of the Patala, they could describe it very well. So fascinating. I found that very fascinating, and I thought I should write about. A lot of people would have heard about the Patala, actually, and not know what they can relate to, because the Patala is on the planet, right? And we should be able to see it. Nothing that today we have drones and planes, and there is nothing that is not visible to us anymore on the planet. But this describes it in that context of the dry ocean bed and below the surface of the earth. So it's below the surface of the earth. It's in the southern hemisphere, and it is on the dry ocean bed when the sage Agastya had drunk up the waters. So a very clear sequence of events has been laid out in the Puranas, and the Patala has been very clearly defined there. So very satisfied with that description. I hope other people find it as well.
Yeah, definitely. These are all very good contributions to the Puranic cosmology that you are dealing with. And while dealing with the earth, you were also talking about gravity.
Yes.
That Indians had
An idea of
understanding of gravity is revealed through Vaisheshika Darshana, particularly from the Prashastapada Bhashya of Vaisheshika Darshana. And you have Surya Siddhanta and other books also, where there is an evidence for the knowledge of gravity. And in Bhagavad Gita also at some point it is said, Dharayami aham ojasa. Pushnami choshadin sarvan. There he says, Dharayami aham ojasa, there that ojas also refers to gravitation. And from the Puranas also you have drawn the idea of gravity, how they were aware of the idea of gravity
Correct, correct.
manifest in Puranas.
So actually, to be honest, the Puranas. So from a scientific standpoint, the concept of a spherical Earth cannot work without gravity. Right? It's fundamental to a spheric. If you say the Earth is a sphere, then people at the South Pole will fall off if you don't have gravity, right? Or anybody anywhere else apart from the North Pole will fall off if you don't have gravity. So gravity and spherical Earth are two concepts that are joined together. They are linked together. They are both essential to each other. And the Puranas, to be honest, don't describe gravity in as much detail because they mention the spherical Earth, and you can derive the spherical Earth from the Puranas. The gravity is explicitly stated in Surya Siddhanta, and then the follow-on Siddhanta Shiromani. So the Surya Siddhanta says very clearly, right? Says that a person standing on the north, on any side, on any north pole or something, thinks he is on the surface just like a person anywhere else on the planet. So basically they are saying that there is, for anywhere in a circular globe, there is one direction up, right? And that direction changes as you go travel around the planet. So that's very clear in the Surya Siddhanta. The Siddhanta Ceremony actually has a phrase which says the earth has a property of attraction. It actually uses this, or the translation has this phrase. And so the property of attraction is the property of gravity, right? So you don't have to interpret anything to say that. It's very explicitly stated that it is gravity. And so I thought I didn't know that. I really didn't know that. For me, it was, I had studied the other, other texts that you had mentioned earlier. And to me, that was quite surprising. And then I went back and said, okay, is this found? And I found on other sources, yeah, this is agreed that people knew about gravity. Now, they didn't obviously have the equations for gravity, for the, the Newton's equations of gravitation, which describes mass, acceleration, and so on. All of that they didn't have. But they had the notion of a spherical Earth. They realized that the spherical Earth can only work if you can have gravity, and they describe gravity as such, right? And so, and this is 2,000 years ago. Right? So I thought that was a significant piece of insight that that the Puranas and the, so I look at the Puranas and the Surya Siddhanta as one body of knowledge, right? So they work off each other, right? There are commonalities, but the Surya Siddhanta is for the scholars. It's for the very highly educated people, and the Puranas are for dissemination of the same knowledge to a wider cross section.
That's what Puranas claim repeatedly, that the purpose of Puranas is to take knowledge to the common man, to take knowledge to the popular understanding. So, and for that purpose, they convert discursive discussion of things into narrative discussion.
Very well.
They make entities into characters.
Correct.
And they make allegorical and other modes of transmission they use, and that's what is happening. And so you very successfully brought out that kind of connection between a discursive book and a narrative book, and the way these two work together. So towards the end of our conversation, I request you to help us understand your presentation of Veda Vyasa in your book, the way you understood Rishi Veda Vyasa, who is the creator of Puranas.
So, so what I present in the book is that we have, my understanding is that we don't credit the sage Veda Vyasa that I think we should, right? Because we don't realize that the Vedas that we see today are the result of Veda Vyasa, separating out the original Vedas into the 4 different Vedas, right? And so he had the 4 pupils. So we get the Vedas from him, we get the Purana Samhita from him, we get the Mahabharata from him, we get the Brahma Sutras from him as Badarayana. And so he says he has given us virtually everything that we consider knowledge in our faith, right? And so I don't think there is another individual in history that has contributed so much by way of knowledge uh, in such great detail, because the Puranas are an encyclopedia, right? So he actually wrote the encyclopedia at that time, essentially. So he wrote something spiritual, right? The Rig Vedas and the Vedas. He wrote something scientific like an encyclopedia, and then he took the same knowledge and put it in the Mahabharata and the beautiful Bhagavad Gita, right? And so if you just look at the contribution that the sage has made, uh, I just felt that it would be inappropriate to write anything on the Puranas without recognizing the great contribution this sage has made. And so I end the book with a salutation to him, basically, because I think it's just enormous. I can't think of any other individual, at least in recorded history, that would have so much knowledge that they can.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very highly befitting thing that you did in your book is to pay tributes to that great figure, Vedavyasa. Thank you very much, sir, for sparing your time and having this conversation with us. This was a very enriching conversation. I know that our viewers also will be highly grateful to you for sharing all these valuable knowledge that you dug out from the Puranas and shared with your readers through your book. And I hope your book will be on the stands very soon, and the whole world of readers will be enriched by the knowledge in your books. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Thank you very much for making that.